Hi guys, it's Aoife from Words of Clover and I'm here to talk about all the books that I read in January. I feel like I've had a really great start to my reading year. I'm really happy with what I've read in January, the type of books I've read so far this year, and yeah, I'm really hoping my reading continues as well as it did in January. So yeah, here's to a really great reading start in 2022. So I read around 12 books I think in January, and I'm going to try and talk about most of them here. So yeah, maybe go and get a cup of tea or a hot drink or something like that to keep you company while I talk, or maybe put me on while you're doing your chores, a bit of ironing or something, I don't know. But yeah, hopefully I won't natter on too long as I'm prone to do, but I will get straight on into it. There are 3 books I think on this list that I'm not going to be talking about in this wrap up because they're actually for a specific video I'm hoping to do in March during the Irish Readathon. So I'm going to leave my views about these books until then, and those books will be kind of delved into a little bit deeper during that video in March. So the first book I read this year was Writers and Lovers by Lily King. This is a book I received from Book Break, so a big thank you to them for sending me this book last year. And this one is quite an interesting story. We are following a girl called Casey. She is in her early 30s. She isn't in like a particularly great solid space in her life. She's kind of living in this almost like garage like apartment. She has like a kind of a job as a waitress that's not like a bit unsteady, and she's kind of trying to finish this book that she's been writing for 6 years, and she's also getting over a recent heartbreak. And also through all of this as well, she's recently lost her mother, so she's kind of, this whole book she's really dealing with that grief of losing her mother and exploring the trauma of that and the effect it's having on her life. And while we read her story in this book, she also meets 2 different men, and she kind of starts a romantic relationship with the both of them. So there's a little bit of like a love triangle-esque-ness to this book, but it's not a real love triangle. It's mostly more about Casey herself and what she's going through in her life, and how she's just kind of struggling day to day to, you know, kind of move forward with her life, kind of being true to herself, trying to be who she wants to be, while also kind of feeling really like slogged down by the grief and just the struggle to keep going when you're like an adult. All these adulting problems, things like bills and loans and, you know, jobs that don't pay very well and apartments that cost too much and things like that. I really enjoy this. I just really like the style of writing that Lily King has. For some reason I thought this was a debut novel, but it actually isn't. I think Lily King has a few other novels as well as short story collections, and I definitely want to check them out after reading this. I feel like there was a real like rawness to the story at times, and there were times that like I was almost like taken aback a little bit by how Casey was living and how she felt like she didn't really need, like she almost turned her nose up at jobs that provided a little bit more steadiness to her life, but she knew that they were probably going to, you know, be detrimental to her at the end. So you kind of had to, I was surprised by her, like, you would think almost like her stupidity, but also it was just her stubbornness and her dedication to what she really wanted to do, which was to eventually be an author. For someone who would eventually love to write my own book, if I ever actually get around to continuing to write it, I thought like just her writing process and the way she kept going with her writing process and what she was writing about, and seeing like other author friends of hers and authors. She was kind of in a very literary circle and she knew authors and she was friends with them and she dated them. And seeing just that world and how it worked as someone who wanted to be an author, and how her friends knew, like kind of like she was afraid to like show anyone her work, but then when she did, the type of feedback she would get. I found that all just like really interesting for myself, and I think anyone who is interested in writing or just in the creative or literary process would really enjoy that as well. I do feel like we did get like a good bit of character growth in Casey. I do think she started to emerge out of this like really bad kind of hole, I guess, that she was in at the start of the book, with her grief and with her life circumstances. I feel like there was definitely like a light at the end of the tunnel by the end of the book, and I enjoyed that a lot. I also think, as I said, I don't think there's a real love triangle in this book at all. I think she has 2 different men at different points in the book that are interested in her, and she's also interested in them, but they also kind of almost they almost portray two different sides of who she could be, and they represent two different things that she wants. There's, you know, a steadiness, and someone who could probably just look after her, and then someone who might just be as a little bit erratic as her, but someone who probably has a lot more passion, or more as much passion as she does about her art. So yeah, I really enjoyed this. I thought it was a great like start to the year, and I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars, and I definitely want to read more of Lily King's work. The next book I picked up was a historical fiction, and this was Cecily by Annie Garthwaite. This is a kind of War of the Roses novels, where we're looking at the lead up to that war, to that time when King Edward ends up taking the throne. But instead of following King Edward and his brothers, King Richard and George, we are actually looking at his parents, and we are following Cecily, who was King Edward's mother, and we see her like at the very start of her married life. She's just after marrying Richard. Basically see how they are within like the royal circle. Like they have a pretty like steady strong position. They're in kind of with the king, and while there are some historical political history there that isn't particularly good for them, they're really eager to, you know, to do what they need to do for the king. They don't have any, you know, real ideas about themselves at this point in the book early on, and it's kind of interesting reading on, seeing how things change, seeing how the kingdom of England and people's ideas about the king and what the king should be, and like the failure of the king and the weakening of the crown, and how that starts to change people's opinions and how people can warp the king to do what he wants them to do. And we see closer and closer to Cecily and Richard getting to the point where there is going to be like this insurrection against the king, and people are going to go against him, and eventually this is going to lead to their son, King Edward, taking the throne. I really wanted to read this because I have read some other books just centered around King Edward and around the War of the Roses and then King Edward's reign, and Cecily was always a very not a villainous, like not necessarily a villainous character in those, but she never was portrayed particularly warmly, and you kind of just know her as this like cold, calculating woman. I'm really interested in seeing something like reading a book about her whole life and her when she was younger, and I found out things about her heritage that I didn't know. She was like, she had kind of royal blood in her line anyway. I really loved how her marriage to Richard was portrayed in this, because so much in historical fiction you do see women, you know, they take a real like backward role when it comes to, or like not necessarily backward, but like they are in the shadows when it comes to like being vocal about what the men should do, what moves should be made when it comes to these political movements. Where with Richard and Cecily, you see Cecily she's in almost every single decision. And it seemed like they had a very equal marriage, and one that was full of love and affection. I mean, they had about like 12 children, I think. And, you know, even while she is bearing these children and birthing them and then helping to raise them, she is still being able to, you know, use her knowledge and use her intelligence in a really great way to help her husband and then her sons. This book wouldn't be for everyone. It's, you know, I think you need to be kind of interested in the subject itself and that time in history, but I definitely did enjoy this, and I just really liked getting to know a little bit more about Cecily. I thought the writing was good. I definitely feel like Annie Garthwaite, like you could feel her passion for Cecily, and I think she brought Cecily to life really, really well. She definitely created this really well-rounded version of this woman in history that we don't really know that much about, and while obviously it is kind of like a fictionalized version, it is her version of who she thinks Cecily would be. It definitely felt probable, and it felt quite real, and it felt like this would be a woman who lived during these times. When you think about all the different like kings really that she lived through, and the times in history that she lived through, and the upheaval and the turmoil, what type of woman would survive all of that? And I definitely think that the version of Cecily that Annie Garthwaite created would survive all of that. So yeah, I gave this like a 3.5 stars to 4 stars, and I did enjoy it. The next book I'm going to talk about is a audiobook that I listened to, and that is Precious Catastrophe by Deirdre Sullivan, and I loved the audiobook narration of this book. I just thought it was done really, really well, and this is the sequel to Preventable Deaths by Deirdre Sullivan, which I read 2 years ago, I think. And that follows two sisters and Catelyn as they move to a new town after their mother remarries, and they move to this town and they're starting to getting to know like this new village / town that they live in, and they start really realizing that something weird is going on in the town. Like, people are a little bit more than they seem, and there's definitely some sort of like supernatural elements going on. And Maddie starts to realise that she might actually have like witch power, like witchcraft powers, and you know, she might have to start like training with the local witch basically to learn how to use these powers. And Catelyn gets distracted by a new boy in her life, and it feels like this relationship isn't particularly like good for her. It might be borderline abusive, and Maddie doesn't really know how to save Catelyn from this, and we see the repercussions of all of that happen by the end of the book. And in Precious Catastrophe, we're following on pretty soon after what happened in Perfectly Preventable Deaths. We are seeing the repercussions of everything that happened at the end of the first book. We're seeing how people are moving on with their lives following things that were very, very traumatic for everyone involved, and we are seeing how that trauma is dealt with. And I just loved seeing how Deirdre Sullivan was able to write these teenage girls dealing with such terrible like things that have happened in their lives, and such very scary things. And in this book we also get Catelyn's point of view. The first book we really only got Maddie's. This one we get Catelyn's, and she is very different to Maddie in a lot of ways, and I just loved her voice. I thought she had such a wonderful voice. I think the narrator did her in particular really, really well. She has this like dry, sarcastic, quite witty tone in her voice and in her character, and the way she was just narrated was just brilliant. Real Irish like reaction to trauma in this book too, where you know, you're kind of, it's not necessarily being internalized, but you're not really speaking about it, but when you do speak about it, it's joke. Is it just in a very like jokey, funny way, while also being quite serious, and you know that there needs to be a little bit more exploration, a little bit more talking about what actually happened, instead of just, you know, she almost died so she should get a second chocolate biscuit. We see more secrets come out about the town. We get to know a little bit more about more of the townspeople as well, and yeah, I really enjoyed this one. I do think it dragged on a little bit for me at the end, like a lot of things happened, and I thought we were like almost near the end, and there was still like 2 hours of the audiobook left, and I couldn't figure out what we had 2 hours left to discuss, to talk about, because it just felt like the book was at its conclusion, like a natural conclusion, and then the rest of it then just felt a little bit drawn out to me. I gave this one a 3.5 out of 5 stars as well. That I read the January book for the Found in Translation book club that I joined just at the end of last year. This is a really great book club where we just really like basically read a translated book every month. I will leave the details for that down below. We read Breasts and Eggs by Mieko Kawakami in January, and I really enjoyed this one. This is set in Tokyo, translated from Japanese obviously, and it's kind of separated into 2 different books that are set 10 years apart. So the first book, we are following our main character as her sister and her niece visit her in Tokyo, and it seems her sister has come to Tokyo to figure out, like, kind of get more information about breast augmentation surgery, and we're seeing like a really great discussion about, I guess, women's bodies and women's appearance, and the pressures on some women in particular industries as well to like look really young all the time and to make these changes to their body. And then we also see the teenage character, how she reacts to some of the decisions that her mother is making, and how it makes her feel kind of a bit small and embarrassed, and she finds it very hard to communicate with her mother when her mother is you know, trying to do these things for herself. It's kind of just putting a strain on their whole relationship. Their main narrator, she is kind of almost, in the first book, she's almost like a spectator. She's almost just like looking at what's happening with her sister and her niece, and she is kind of narrating it back to us, and she's kind of almost like an impartial observer to everything, and she's kind of trying to help them a little bit. She doesn't really know what to do. And then in the next book, we are following the same narrator 10 years later. This time she is on her own. She has gone up a little bit in life. She's having a little bit more success in what she wanted to do, but now we see her start looking into becoming a mother through a sperm donation. But in Japan, it seems that there is like a stigma to single women alone wanting to have children via sperm donation, and she has to kind of look at like the black market for IVF, for this type of IVF and for this type of sperm donation, which is obviously, you know, like dangerous in like a lot of different ways. And and we see kind of the lengths that she might be willing to go to do this, but also why is it that she wants to do this? Does she really want to become a mother? Like, what is it about motherhood that she wants? And we see that being explored in a lot of different ways throughout the book. The two different parts were really great in each, like, on their own and together. I feel like with the first book, our main character, as I said, she's more of a spectator, so then I feel like we really got to know her in the second part of the book, and we'll really get to see like who she is, kind of how she grew up, not necessarily her relationship with her sister, but more her relationship with herself and her relationship with her own sexuality and her own desires, whether it was like with her career or with, you know, being a mother, and what all that meant to her. I think the writing was just flawless. I loved the writing in this. I'm definitely going to be reading more of Mieko's work because I just really enjoy the writing, and the translation is brilliant. And from what I've seen, the same two people translate all of her other books into English, so I'm presuming the translation for them must be just as good as this one, because I just felt like the translation, now obviously I don't know Japanese, so I don't know, but it felt to me that the translation for this was just really, really good. And I've heard from other people that they think it was really good as well, so hopefully that is a general consensus. I gave this a 4 out of 5 stars. I really, really enjoyed it, and I'm really glad I picked it up for this book club. Next book I read was one of my most excited about books that I wanted to read, and that was Yinka, Where Is Your Husband? This is just a really nice contemporary fiction book about a young woman called Yinka. She is in her 30s. She, you know, has her own house, she has a pretty good job, and that doesn't really matter so much to her mother and her aunties, because all they care about is that she gets a husband and she gets married and she has children. So she's dealing with a lot of, I guess, pressures that come from her Nigerian culture, that, you know, what a woman should want to aspire to is to be a wife and to be a mother. And, you know, while it's great that she has a job and that she has her own house and she's able to provide for herself, she should be really striving to have all these other things as well, that unless she is a mother and unless she is a wife and a mother, she will never be good enough, I guess, in the eyes of some of her family members. And she's really struggling with that. She's really getting down about it. She hasn't been in a relationship for a while, so she has 6 months or so to dedicate herself to finding a man to bring to her cousin's wedding, and hopefully maybe he'll eventually become her husband, who knows. So we follow Yinka while she kind of goes on this journey, and she kind of starts figuring out what the type of guy that she would like to date, and she kind of goes on a lot of learning about herself in a way, and not always in necessarily a good way. She kind of goes through spirals where she goes through downward spirals a lot, about her own appearance. You see her struggle with a lot of things like internalized colorism, and then she also is remembering some of the racist remarks she used to hear in school, and it really affects her own confidence and her own her belief in herself. She tries to make some changes to herself that might not necessarily be the best thing that she should do for herself, instead of she should just be herself. So this was fun, and I did really enjoy it. I think for a first book, the writing was really fun. I really enjoyed learning so much about Nigerian culture, and there were a lot of moments in this around family. Her family is such a big important part of her life, as well as her friends. Her friends are basically her family, her best friends are her cousins. I did think she was a little bit immature at times, which I just felt a little bit she's 31 years old, and I think there was a lot of almost high school drama going on between her and some of her friends in this, and it just felt a little bit too much for me. And then also some of just her reactions when it came to some of her dating life was just really cringy, and she was just really jumping the gun a little bit too much sometimes, and I just wanted to grab into the book and hold her back and be no, stop, just have a little bit of, not self-control, but a little bit more respect for yourself, and don't always keep a little bit things hidden until you know a little bit more about the situation at hand. So yeah, just a little bit of, I guess, not knowing too much about the dating circle, not having enough experience. It definitely came through a little bit with some of her actions that were sometimes just a little bit hard to read because you were just embarrassed for her. She also have a really strong faith. She is a Christian in this as well, and you see that play a really big, a really important part in her life, particularly in her dating life, because she does want to save herself for marriage. And I think you don't really see that a lot in books. I liked seeing that. It was nice to see that included, and I think a lot of people would really appreciate seeing that in the book too. So yeah, this was good. It was really fun, it was vibrant, but there were just some things within it that just weren't as good as I wanted them to be. but I still had a lot of fun reading this, so I gave it a 3 out of 5 stars. The book I read was the first book in the 12 books that my friend gave me for Christmas that are all wrapped up, and each month I'm going to unwrap one and read it. So the first book that I unwrapped was Regretting You by Colleen Hoover. Now, I have never read a Colleen Hoover book before. I obviously know about her and about her books because I've been on BookTube for a while, and she is kind of like a BookTube darling, but her books never really appealed to me that much from everything that I've heard about them. But when I unwrapped this one, I was like, okay, time for me to give Colleen Hoover a go. I will see what I think and see what all the hype is about. And guys, I'm gonna say I don't understand it at all because I really dislike this book. I'm not a Colleen Hoover fan, and I don't think I will ever be picking up another book from her. This one we are following a woman called Morgan and her daughter Clara. Morgan had Clara when she was only like 16 or 17, so she had her very young. And she stayed with her boyfriend Chris, and they got married, and now, you know, Clara is, you know, that high school age, coming closer to college, and then something really, really bad happens, and Morgan and Clara are basically facing a life now without the other person in their life, without their husband, without their dad, and because of the accident that caused all of this, they find other things out about his life that, well, Morgan finds other things out about his life that she might not necessarily have wanted to know, and she has a really hard time kind of moving on and figuring out what to do next. And Clara starts kind of acting out a little bit within her grief, and then with her relationship with her mother that becomes strained because of all of their grief. And we just see how they handle it all, and this book was just awful. Like, I just don't understand. I don't know, I don't understand. I just thought it was really, really basic. Like, there was nothing in this book that surprised me. I saw everything coming from a mile off. I just thought, like, there were times it was hard to read because it was just so like simple in a way. Like, it was just so boring, basic writing. The storyline, there's nothing about the storyline that was particularly exciting. There was a lot of potential for some of the characters to have like really great storylines. Morgan in particular, you know, she missed out on her college because she was obviously raising a young child, and I felt like there was she kept thinking about, you know, going into college or pursuing a new career, finally pursuing a career for herself and doing things for herself, and we just see her thinking about that a lot and not actually doing anything. And I was like, there could have been such a great part of this storyline of Morgan going to college as an adult and figuring things out for herself and figuring out what her true path is and what she wants to do for the rest of her life. Like, she's only in her like mid-30s, she's still a very young woman, and it just felt like, you know, it just didn't happen. Like, she was just moping around the house, and yeah, I just felt like there was a real lost opportunity there. And then Clara the teenager was just a really annoying character. I understand that she had a lot of grief in this book and she was dealing with that, but the way she acted around like a guy who becomes her boyfriend very quickly in this book, like really quickly, like went from 0 to 100 with this relationship. It was very strange, and it was the type of relationship that was such a teenage relationship that it was hard to read because it was just disgusting. Like, it just, like, there was just so many things in it that just like made me cringe and made me uncomfortable, and I just really hated reading about them because I just thought they were so gross and so over the top. And yeah, maybe I'm just like too old to be reading about that type of relationship anymore, but yeah, I just really did not like it at all. I found this book really boring because there was nothing in it, as I said, that surprised me. I knew exactly what was going to happen from like the first page to the last page, and everything that happened played out exactly the way I thought it would. And yeah, so I gave it a 2 out of 5 stars. And I don't think I'll be picking up another Colleen Hoover book anytime soon. The book I read was also a book translated, and this one was for Lauren and the Book's Patreon book club that I'm also a part of, and this was Crimson by Niviaq Korneliussen, and this one is set in Greenland, and so it is translated from Greenlandic, and this one is quite interesting. This one also has a couple of other titles. I think One Night in Nuke is one of the other titles for this. We are following 5 different people who all live in this one town, and it's real kind of slice of life, like flow of thought type of book, where you're just following them on like different nights out. We're seeing them meet each other, and it's real like them exploring who they are. There's a lot of like exploring of sexuality in this, and exploration of identity, including gender identity, and not really like that much happens in this except just these young people being young people, going out drinking and dancing and hooking up and figuring out who the hell they are, what the hell they're doing, like what's next. I quite enjoyed this. I enjoyed it probably more than I thought I would when I first started reading it and saw it was this kind of stream of consciousness type of like style of writing, but I fell into the flow of it really, really quickly, and I just really enjoyed my time like reading it, and just being in Nuke for this like short period of time and seeing how these people lived and how they interacted with each other. I would say like there were times that I wish we could have gotten a little bit more from all of the characters, and there was definitely like felt like there was not as much, you know, you didn't really get to know them that well. And I did quite enjoy the writing and like the style that the author was going for, and I think I would read more of this author's work when it's translated into English, because I would love to see more of what she writes, particularly if it's set in Greenland or book. It doesn't really take you that long to read. I gave it a 3 out of 5 stars, and yeah, as I said, I would read more from the author. The book I'm going to talk about is the next audiobook that I read during January, and that was Crying in H Mart by Michelle Zauner. This is also narrated by the author, and it is a memoir about her experience caring for her mother, who became terminally ill from cancer, and then losing her mother, the grief of that, and how she used food, and Korean food in particular, to connect to her mother again. So there's lots of food kind of conversations and descriptions and stuff in this book, as well as kind of music descriptions, as well as just like parental relationships. And yeah, so obviously there's this like a real content warning for death of a parent, as well as just caring for a sick loved one, and there's lots of like descriptions about the care that Michelle has to give to her mother as she becomes increasingly more sick. It's something that, you know, would bother you or upset you anyway. Just be really careful going into this book, because it is very, very heavy. I did really enjoy like listening to this book, because Michelle obviously narrates it herself. She knows exactly how she wants her story to go, and I think particularly with memoirs, it's sometimes the best way to experience them, because you're having the author read it in their own words. So yeah, what's better than that? I thought the writing in this was really, really good. I just genuinely just enjoyed Michelle talking about her mother, the love she had for her mother, as well as like the tough times she had with her mother, especially as a teenager, and you know, the fights you get in with your mom, and the silly times that like you say really hurtful things and they say hurtful things to you, but then the overwhelming love like that a mother has for their child, and how is it possible that the love your mother has for you is the strongest love that you will ever experience. I just really enjoyed listening to it and thinking about a lot of things, and it made me want to hug my mum a lot. Again, I say if you have lost a loved one, particularly if you've lost a mother figure in your life, I do think this book would be hard to read, because the whole time I was reading this, I just wanted to run home and hug my mum, and I'm in a very fortunate position in my life that I can do that if I want to, and I think if you couldn't do that while reading this book, it might be very difficult. There was lots of Korean food descriptions in this. Now this is one of the big things that people talk about when they talk about this book, is the food descriptions, and I will say they didn't do it for me as much as I think they do it for other people, and I think this is mostly just because I haven't really eaten any, like very little if any, Korean food in my life, which I know is probably very shocking. I don't think we have a lot of Korean like restaurants in Ireland, or at least ones that I don't know of any, and I haven't been to any. So a lot of like the stuff that she was talking about, just, you know, is stuff that I've never really had. It might not be stuff that I know like what it tastes like or what it looks like. So yeah, some of that description probably just didn't hit me the way it would probably hit other people who are really big into Korean or Asian food, and yeah, would like have their like maybe their mouth salivating while they were reading these delicious food descriptions. Like it definitely sounded nice, but not enough that like I didn't know enough about it for me to be like, okay, I really want Korean food now. For me, the thing I liked the most about this was Michelle's relationship with her mother, and just her talking about like how she felt going through all of this with her mother, and like facing life without her mother. Like she lost her mother so young. She was only in her like mid-20s when she lost her mother, and yeah, it just feels like I don't think you're ever old enough to lose your mother, but particularly when you're that young, like it's so tough. I think she wrote about it just so well and so eloquently, and I just really enjoyed this one. I gave it a 5 out of 5 stars, and I would definitely recommend it for people to read, and I would 100% recommend the audiobook of this one because it was just brilliant. And then the last book I finished in January was Bone Silence by Alaistair Reynolds. This is the 3rd book in the Revenger series, which I've been reading the last couple of years, and we are following 2 sisters who run away into space, and they basically become pirates in space. So the best way to describe like what is happening in this book is just to read like what's on the inside cover. And it is The Ness sisters are being hunted for crimes they didn't commit by a fleet whose crimes are worse than their own. If they're to survive and stay one step ahead of their pursuers, if they're to answer the questions which have plagued them, it's going to require every dirty piratical trick in the book. So yeah, there is a lot going on in this book. We're following, you know, these girls and their crew who are dealing with a reputation that isn't actually their own, and they're getting repercussions because of that. And in this book, there's a lot of, you know, life and death situations in this book. They're kind of stuck in this particular battle, like this battle between two ships for quite a large part of this book. And I will say there were some losses in this that I wasn't prepared for, and I was very sad about. We also see the sisters separate at one point, and they're both on like their own kind of different missions, both learning like different things and also at the same time trying to come back together. We get a lot of answers about a lot of vague things that happen in book 1 and book 2, and things that we were kind of learning about, things about like aliens and like aliens from the future and aliens from the past, and things that like the current like population of this world are using that might actually be like ancient alien artifacts that might have a different purpose than what anyone thinks that they are. And we're seeing what that actually is in this book and the effect it might have on the world, and it's very hard to explain without people reading the book. But I really enjoyed where this went, and I do think that there's definitely a lot of potential for Alaistair Reynolds to expand on this world that he's created and some of the things that he explores within this book. And I would really, really love a future book that has, maybe not necessarily following the Ness sisters themselves, but at least has like cameos of them. That would be really, really fun. And he does say at the back that he's done with the Ness sisters for now, but he doesn't know if they're done with him. And I feel like that there's just a lot of potential in that line. So yeah, I'm really looking forward to more books from Alaistair Reynolds, and I do have to read his backlist too, because I've heard really great things about his other books, so I do want to read them. So I gave this a 4 out of 5 stars, and I really enjoyed it, and I'm just really glad to have finished a trilogy as well. So yay, go me. So that is everything that I've read in January, apart from some of the books that, as I said, I'll be talking about later on in the year in March. Yeah, I just had a really great reading month. Have read some really great books, really interesting books. So please let me know your comments. Like, have you read any of these books? Are any of these books on your horizon? What do you think of them? Thank you guys so much for watching as always, and I'll see you guys again next time.